Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on the role of technology solutions in fighting the climate crisis as part of our Devex at COP26 series of conversations. I'm Catherine Cheney. I'm a senior reporter at Devex focused on technology and innovation and global development, and I'm really thrilled to be moderating this live panel. So just a bit of context before we dive in. To meet climate targets, countries need to quantify, monitor, and reduce their emissions. And of course, technology will be critical in each step of this process. And because repairing the damage that's already been done by climate change will require more than cutting emissions, there's growing interest in technologies like carbon removal and solar geoengineering. You've seen those topics come up on the COP26 agenda. But in addition to developing new technology, we also need to drive down the cost of existing low carbon technologies in order to deploy these technologies everywhere in the world, including in the low and middle income countries that are most impacted by climate change. So today we'll hear from 3 leaders who are tackling climate technology solutions from a number of angles, and I'll quickly introduce them before we dive into the conversation. You'll see them here. Ifeoma Malo is CEO of Clean Technology Hub Nigeria, which is focused on promoting energy access through research, development, demonstration, and incubation of clean energy technologies. She's also the former country campaign director for Power for All in Nigeria, and she led Nigeria's campaign to promote distributed renewable energy and is one of the country's leading energy access experts. Zack Parisa is the co-founder and CEO of NCX. He's working on a carbon exchange built on reliable data. So the technology breakthrough here, as I understand it, and I'll let him expand on this, is combining satellite imagery with field measurements to determine the size and species of every acre of forest in the US. NCX helps American landowners get paid for the carbon they capture in standing trees. And I'm excited to talk with him about this model, or work like it might be extended to low and middle income countries. And Olamide Oguntoye is tech policy lead for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. He leads policy work at the Tony Blair Institute on energy and climate tech. And recently, Olamide has been active in discussions about sustainability in Africa, as well as the role of connectivity in combating climate change, something I definitely hope we can get to. So thank you all so much for joining us. Really looking forward to the conversation. So my first question is for you, Ife. I know that Clean Technology Hub Nigeria is committed to supporting the next generation of Africa's clean energy leaders. And I really want to make sure in this conversation, we're focused on not just climate technology solutions in the broader sense, but climate technology solutions emerging from everywhere and extending to everywhere. So your mission is very relevant here. And my question for you is what do you see as the big challenges and opportunities to do just that, your mission, support the next generation of Africa's clean energy leaders?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to all of the other panelists and organizers. Very happy to be here. So at Clean Tech Hub, we're one of the leading innovation and acceleration centers in West Africa. One of the things that we're seeing with our portfolio of companies is that we're able to get them to do demos of their technologies, their clean technologies, but it's difficult to get them to scale. Part of that challenge is not just the financing part, but it's also the raw materials that they're using to fabricate these technologies in-house. And to get them to scale, they actually need to bring in raw materials through supply chain mechanisms from outside of the country. Now, that's where issues then come in for them, because they're now dealing with issues around supply chain management, procurement, international procurement, customs. But these are very small companies. So what we need to do is to get people who can actually look at their technologies and then help invest in them locally and help them to think about how to get them to market, to scale. Because a lot of the technologies that are developed in Nigeria, at least the ones that we've seen, actually with a bit more push, can actually begin to produce at scale. We see that being done in locally fabricated clean cook stoves, which are then sometimes cheaper and easier to maintain than what we would ordinarily get if they were imported. So the 3 things that I would say are the challenge are a belief in the entrepreneur's demo, looking at sourcing local materials to help them to scale, and local materials that can help them actually make the technologies that they have brought out a bit more steadier and stronger, and also beginning to put in a lot of local financing so that they are not stuck in trying to raise external financing at such a small stage, because they're still very young companies, to be able to help them be distributed locally in the local markets. So those are the three things I would say that we have to begin to really think about to look at local technologies scaling locally in the communities that they're produced.
Thank you, Ife. And I know you're working to tackle those challenges, but also there's, I assume, an opportunity for the global development community to do even more. I know there's been a big focus on local financing for climate tech entrepreneurs, but it sounds like it's not really moving the needle yet to the extent it needs to where you're working. So thank you for that preview of your work. I want to bring Zack into this conversation. So Zack, I know you're joining us from Glasgow. So sure. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy. I'm seeing your name pop up all over the COP26 agenda, especially events focused on exactly this, climate technology solutions. So I mentioned earlier a little bit about how NCX works, but I wonder if you can kind of expand on the technology itself and how it helps landowners quantify the full value of their forests. And I want to add that I know you're focused on the US, but part of why I wanted to include you in this conversation is I wonder if you can talk about how your model or a similar approach might work globally, including in low and middle income countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And Catherine, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be with all the panelists here. So so just like you said, we use satellite imagery and ground measurements to measure every acre or every hectare of forest every year down to the number of trees by size and species. And that's really important because in order to create markets that can pay landowners to create more forests, to create more carbon dense forests, and to that's respectful of things like biodiversity, water and fire risk, we need robust measurements. These markets are fundamentally different than what we've seen before with extractive markets like timber. With those markets, there's a scale at the mill and there's a physical good that rolls off the property and that people take delivery of. With these, with carbon, with biodiversity, these benefits are happening out in the woods. And so to earn trust, to have trust with these communities, with these landowners, that they're getting paid fairly for the work that they're doing to create these benefits that we all need, and to make sure that the communities, countries, and companies that are paying for these positive outcomes have transparency in what is actually being done on the ground. We need robust measurements, and so really the measurements make the market, and that's been our approach. You ask about expanding to other countries. That's what's different today than where I think we were, even a decade ago, 5 years ago, is that we do have the tools with, for monitoring. We have a lot more satellite sensors up. We have a lot more computational ability, and while there's that part, we also have much more sort of community engagement and I think political will to really expand this further. So our intent is to expand market access, truly democratize access to these markets globally to the people and places that are at greatest risk.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to follow your journey as you look at the global potential for your model. I actually learned about your work in a conversation on climate tech solutions where Mark Benioff from Salesforce mentioned NCX as an exciting company to watch in this space. So that put you on my radar, and really looking forward to following what you do next. A question for Olamide, and part of why I'm so excited to have your perspective is I think you can kind of give us what you see as the landscape of technological solutions here. So I wonder, we've heard from Ife about her work with energy access entrepreneurs in Nigeria. We've heard from Zack about his work on a really exciting technology solution here in the US and potential for global expansion there. So what do you see as some of the most exciting technological solutions for climate change across all the areas I mentioned earlier? What's exciting? What's potentially game-changing? And critically, what role do policymakers have to play in order to ensure that these tech solutions realize their potential?
All right, thanks very much, Catherine. And it's great to be here. Nice to see Zack and Ife. In terms of what's exciting, there is a lot to be excited about. Climate tech is in that phase where virtually everybody and anyone has an opinion about it. And an event like COP26 is even driving up further media engagement. So there's a lot of exciting things out there. It can be a bit challenging though, because then it also creates a bit of distraction, which then gives policymakers an issue cutting through the noise and figuring out what's really the thing to focus on. But everything from the technologies we use to replace the old incandescent bulb to the technologies we use to heat up our homes to, direct air capture and things like that. There's a whole range of development happening across the climate tech landscape. And many of them are quite exciting. The ones that I'm particularly interested in, and I just generally find exciting, are those ones that are clearly on a learning curve. And what that means is simply technologies whose price gets to decrease with increasing installation. And we've seen that with quite a number of technologies like solar, for example. In 2009, just about 10 years ago, the price of solar was that. Just 10 years later, it's this. It's gone down by about 90%. If you look at onshore wind, for example, the price has gone down about 75% in just 10 years. And the same kind of learning curve evolution is happening across board in areas like batteries and in some other interesting areas of climate tech. So for me, that's quite exciting. Even though there's so much noise out there, and you have to be able to kind of distinguish between what's the noise and what's really happening, what's the real change. I think there's a lot of opportunity for optimism here. And one of the things we've done, and I've led some of the projects so far at the Tony Blair Institute, is to look at the landscape and to kind of categorize these technologies into 3 big buckets. So the ones that are already here and now and are already mature, the ones that are a bit on the other extreme end, which needs a bit more R&D support, and everything in between, which needs to be scaled up and ramped up in terms of deployment. So those are the technologies that are out there, and I'm quite excited about them. In terms of what policymakers can do, also along the lines of those 3 buckets, we have things around standardizing some sorts of technologies. So, for example, the energy efficiency technologies for our homes, and on the other extreme end, where you have R&D support, it's important for policymakers to start kind of looking at what are the bottlenecks, for example, around experimentation and demonstration, which can be supported with public finance. And then everything in between, which requires a bit of public-private partnerships and supporting entrepreneurs and startups to make sure that these technology solutions can be deployed at scale to the market.
Thank you. I love that framing of the 3 buckets. And I want to remain on that point for a moment, because I think it's a good way to have a conversation, the 4 of us. But I also see some questions coming up in the Zoom, which we really welcome. That's the benefit of a live panel here. So please keep those questions coming, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. But keeping on this point from Olamide, so these 3 buckets: technologies that are available and mature, but need to standardize; emerging tech that needs R&D support; and then everything in between, tech that needs to be ramped up by engaging with innovators and entrepreneurs, which I would say is particularly challenging often in low middle income country contexts. So I wonder, it looks like we may have lost Ife. Hopefully she will be coming back shortly. But Zack, a question for you here. Where do you see yourself fitting in these 3 buckets? And do you think that that's a helpful framework? Do you look at the ecosystem of climate tech solutions similarly, or would you maybe reframe?
No, I think Olamide's framing is actually great. Forests and other nature-based solutions are one of the first best options that we have for sort of emission reduction. And so it was really great seeing commitments to reduce, and eliminate deforestation and carbon removal. And they're sort of the here and now. There have been technical hurdles that have been largely worked through, and there is still need for standardization and clarification of quality in that work. So there's more to do there, but it's really going to take everything to bend the arc on climate change. And so it's really encouraging seeing a lot of the work coming out of so many places, especially beyond Silicon Valley, in the places, as if he was mentioning, where capacity building is so vitally important. And as we work with forests, and nature-based solutions, they're not an infinite sponge. And so we need that cost curve to be coming down on those technologies that Olamide was talking about that are further out. And really by working, both fronts and really investing ourselves and working kind of collectively as a community to drive these things forward, that's how we're going to get to real solutions, not picking one and saying this is the answer or that is. It's really a yes and situation. But to the point, the important thing here is that forests are one of they are and nature-based solutions overall. I should be more inclusive there, but they're what we can immediately work with today as we make the investments necessary in communities and technology to, to be there, further out with the tech we need to fully remove carbon from the atmosphere and decarbonize our economy overall.
Thanks, Zach. I'm going to ask you a question that came in from the audience, and I'll just relay it directly. The question is remote sensing and satellite technology used to verify landowner reports?
It is, yeah. So satellite imagery and computational technology that allows us to assess that and derive like meaningful and actionable information from that data is what enables us, broadly to, to drive down transaction costs and to ensure trust through that transaction, whether you're working in the United States, Brazil, Indonesia, Guatemala, wherever it is. And the exciting thing is that that's globally available. Those data are globally available. We also use ground measurements to make sure that those assessments are well calibrated. And there's the opportunity, with that for further community engagement. And so that's, yeah.
Thanks, Zach. Really helpful. So I want to talk about climate tech solutions and how they fared in the COP26 agenda specifically. So I guess I'll start with Zach here. Zach, I know again, you're there in Glasgow. You've been involved in a number of conversations on climate tech. So thank you for making time for this one. But how would you say climate technology fared in the COP26 agenda? And can you kind of take us inside some of the conversations you've been having on this topic?
I think there's been a lot of excitement and sort of engagement around the investments in technology. Seeing the private sector really step up and commit large sums to developing these technologies, not just with nature-based solutions, although again, there was a lot of emphasis on that, not only carbon and nature-based solutions, but the communities and biodiversity related to those, and that was really great. But to Olamide's point earlier, that that the full suite of technology is going to require investment, and at least we're seeing commitments that look like that's going to be made, and it's going to be made globally, and that that's like when you started out, it truly is going to take all of us and every yeah. So I'd be interested in hearing from Olamide on sort of his thoughts on how the commitments shaped up and if they meet his.
Yeah, exactly. And quickly,
Yeah.
I'll say, Olamide, I'd be interested in both your reflections on how climate tech has fared at COP26, and if you were to somehow pull out a magic wand and turn COP26 into a win for climate tech, what would that look like?
All right. Oh, I need a wand now. Okay. I think so far I would say it's been a mixed bag, but perhaps a bit slightly more on the positive side of things. So it's been good to see some of this private sector commitment and also some public-private partnership types of commitment. So, for example, the Glasgow Breakthroughs, which has been led by the British government and has the collaboration with quite a number of big countries, including China, the US, and Australia, where they're looking at developing certain suites of green technologies, including green electricity, and I think it also includes a bit of green or sustainable aviation fuel, and quite a number of interesting technologies. So that's very encouraging to see. Of course, on the other hand, you have people like Jeff Bezos throwing in $2 billion into nature conservation, which is also quite encouraging, and et cetera, et cetera. You have quite a number of such commitments. Some of them have massive supports covering multiple countries. Some of them are kind of led by just a few group of countries or individuals. But on the other end, you also see a lot of the routine finger pointing between countries, countries calling out each other and saying you're not doing enough. So those things have a way of distracting from the real agenda. We're at a time where every second draws us closer to 2050 targets, 2035 targets, 2030 targets. The last thing you want to do is to waste another year of COP. Matter of fact, there was no COP last year. It was deferred to this year. So we lost two full years. So that's the last thing you want to do. You want urgent action, and anything else that will distract from putting our money into climate tech should be limited and avoided. But unfortunately, we've seen a bit of that. But overall, I would say it's been a bit more on the positive side of things.
Thank you, Olamide. And Ife, good to see you again. I know you were bumped off. Sorry about that. Just to try and bring you into this question, and not intending to put you on the spot, but I was just asking Zack and Olamide, basically, how has climate technology specifically fared on the COP26 agenda? And I wonder, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that while you're based in Nigeria, you're actually in East Africa right now for some meetings that are related to the ongoing conversations in Glasgow, which I thought was really interesting. So I wonder, Zack kind of pulled back the curtain on some of his conversations in Glasgow. Can you take us into what are some of the conversations in East Africa right now? What are the conversations among people like yourself who are supporting this climate tech entrepreneurial ecosystem? Do you think that climate tech is on the agenda in the way it should be at COP26, or how would you reframe the conversation?
That's actually a very good question. So I'm in Kenya as part of the Mini Grid Developers Association, the African Mini Grid Developers Association. And this is a group of developers that are driving mini and microgrids for rural and peri-urban communities. One of the big conversations that we're having here is around data and the lack of it, actually. And to the extent that there is even any data, the lack of synchronization in the data, the lack of certainty in the data. And yet, I mean, this is a problem in sub-Saharan Africa that is a barrier for mini-grid scaling. And yet there are tools to address that. There's obviously a lot of technology tools to address issues around data. There are quite a few companies, about 3 or 4 big known ones on the continent that are trying to address issues around data using IoT, Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence to do that. Now, when it comes to COP, I think there's an assumption that we see from those of us in the global South that there is, when it comes to the technology, that it's almost like a settled topic because, you know, it's easily available in the West. And so the way that the conversations are framed is, well, how are we going to scale it? What can we do with the data that is already available? And how do we help the companies that are harnessing this data to use it more effectively? It's a different conversation here. The conversation we're having here is there isn't enough data. We're not being able to extract the data using a lot of the remote monitoring systems that are easily available, like I said, elsewhere. And when we do that, you know, there's a lot of issues around how we can deploy it. Also because there's a lot of mistrust between national governments from this side and the technology providers who are mostly foreign investors. And so the question then is, you know, governments are then suspicious also about how this data is going to be utilized. So those are, from a policy level, there's that conversation and tension happening between government and technology providers. And from a technical level, there is also that assumption that, you know, because issues around hardware and software when it comes to technology are settled, almost settled issues in the West, that they're the same here in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's not the case. So a lot of the developers here are still struggling to understand, even, you know, when they want to do site selections, how they go about that. Do they have to travel and use remote, take the risks of going into remote villages that they don't really know very well to go collect that data? But we do know that there are other ways of doing that. And so that's that disconnect that's happening. And we see it very evidently at COP, where there's this conversation up here, and then we're having these other conversations down here. So at some point, we have to begin to talk to each other.
Totally agreed. Thank you. No, that's why I'm so grateful for this virtual platform so that we can all come together from Glasgow and from Kenya, and really appreciate your perspective there. We just have a few minutes remaining, but I did want to go back to Olamide on something because I sort of previewed this earlier, and I think it builds on what Ife was just mentioning in terms of connectivity being a challenge as well. So Olamide, I know you've focused on connectivity and energy access, and I wonder if you can help us better understand why that's such a barrier when it comes to scaling up clean technology solutions really globally.
Right, absolutely. Thanks very much. So yeah, in terms of connectivity, the main thing is the fact that it's a very key enabler, as Ife rightly mentioned. It's how you get your men in the field. It's how you get the mini grids up and running in the remote parts of southwestern Malawi, somewhere in the backside of the mountain. It's how you do your maintenance checks. It's how you get some of these clean technologies deployed at scale and up and running at the most efficient level. So it's extremely important. And what we have at the moment in Africa and in some other parts of the world is an internet penetration level that is still not where it should be yet. It's a mobile penetration level that is still not at the level where it should be yet. And that's why it's a big barrier to the scale up of some of these technologies. The gaps are gradually being closed. We can see some of the numbers around connectivity being increased. If you look at different generations of connectivity technologies, so for example, the old school GPRS, 2G type of connection, the number of years it took to get to a certain population, like a 1 billion population, is far longer than how long it took 3G to get to 1 billion, which is far longer than how long it took 4G. And there are predictions that 5G is going to happen even much faster. And that's because each new generation can leverage the existing connectivity infrastructure to get to more people. So with a bit of optimism, we can hope that connectivity issues will be getting more and more better addressed, and the gaps will be closed. But it still plays a very fundamental role to the scaling up and the enablement of clean technology deployment in Africa.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned the public-private partnerships that will be needed earlier, especially in that middle ground of those three buckets, the sort of everything in between, public-private partnerships to advance connectivity will be critical. So seeing a lot of activity in this space, but there needs to be more. So with just a few minutes left here, I want to go back to each of you, and in about a minute, if you can you expand on, we mentioned at the outset, we need to incentivize breakthrough climate technologies, but we also need to democratize those innovations that already exist. So my question for each of you, if you have a call to action coming out of COP26, what's one thing you want to leave our audience with when it comes to either of those things? How to incentivize breakthrough climate technologies, or how to democratize those innovations that already exist? And if time allows, you can tackle both if you'd like. I'll start with Zack, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah. So really excellent points from Ify and Olamide there. Like, in terms not just that these tech, like some of the tech isn't fully available to all communities, and there's a lot that needs to be done to close that gap. But also that those technology solutions often aren't just drop-in solutions, that we really need to take social context into account if we're going to bring these opportunities to every community and truly be able to scale the solutions as quickly as we need to, and to the point that we need to. And so, yeah, when it comes to a call to action, what can folks do? Get involved in capacity building in whatever community you are in, and work to empower those that are working in adjacent communities or communities that are connected to the supply chains that you are involved in. If you have the opportunity to invest in these technologies, recognizing that many of them are nascent and have a lot of development to go, do that. But overall, just get involved in the conversation and find opportunities to either be fully engaged in the innovation yourself or support those that are.
Great, thank you, Zack. Ify, would love to hear your perspective on this. What's your call to action?
I completely agree with Zack. I think mentoring and educating the growing technology entrepreneurs here, especially the renewable energy entrepreneurs, are very important. But even more important is to look at what has happened in Nigeria in the banking sector. A lot of the back-end support for our banking sector has been done by local developers in Nigeria. We need to begin to look at how this local tech can meet local renewable energy needs, just so that we're not waiting for when there's going to be technology that comes from outside the country to come support the ecosystem here. So, and that grew organically because there was a lot of focus in building the capacity, the human capital that could help drive the banking sector. We have banks in rural areas, in some of the most rural areas across Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. How can we do that for the renewable energy sector? That's the big question.
Thank you, Ify. Olamide, we'll give you the last word.
All right. I completely agree with Zack and Ify. I think for me, on top of all that, it's also to get a bit more aggressive with the conversations at an event like COP26. And I think it's high time to have a sort of Paris agreement for climate innovation. We need that level of ambition. COP in the past years have delivered some level of milestones in the past. So in 2009, we had the COP in Copenhagen that delivered the $100 billion climate finance agreement. In 2015, you had the Paris Agreement that delivered the 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees commitment. I think it's high time to have another sort of massive global aggressive agreement around climate tech and innovation. And I think that's the call to action.
Thank you. If we had more time, my follow-up question for all of you would be, okay, what would this Paris Agreement for climate tech innovation look like? But we'll have to hold that conversation for another time. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to share your insights on this topic. Thanks for the work you're doing in this space, and hope to see a lot more progress on all the work you're doing in climate tech innovation more broadly in the next year. We really need it. So thank you all so much again.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.